When we look at the tens or if not hundreds of thousands of casualties that the Russians have expended to advance the additional 25 plus kilometers to get from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, really the gains are not tremendous. It's not a rapid advance. It is quite literally a foot pace of advance, literally in terms of that's what a human does, but also those are the dismounted infantry tactics that have dominated the march to Pokrovsk. And what we're seeing here is, the culmination of this 18-month effort. It does not pretend that we are going to get a Russian breakthrough of the line after the seizure of Pokrovsk. In fact, the Russians are optimized for positional warfare and more of this dismounted, grindy sort of warfare.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by George Barros, who is the Russia and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War. George, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hey Louis, good to see you once again. Thanks for having me.
Well, George, Russia is focusing in on capturing Pokrovsk at the moment. It's been a more than year-long mission and one that I think many thought would not take as much time as it has. What's the situation there now?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult situation for the Ukrainian defenders. It's really a question of time until the Russian forces eventually complete the seizure of Pokrovsk. Russian infiltration groups have successfully penetrated into Pokrovsk, and they are engaged in street fighting and building fighting to take the city. It's going to fall in a matter of days, if not days and weeks. We shall see. The key question is really within the larger Pokrovsk and Pyrrhic pocket on the map, will Ukrainian forces be able to withdraw in good order? Will they be able to successfully attrit and destroy a lot of combat power for whatever Ukrainian casualties they receive? And what will that sort of look like? I think it's very important to study the campaign for Pokrovsk, because this wasn't just a battle for a city. This was a Russian campaign to take Pokrovsk within the context of time and space. Everyone's paying very close attention to it now, because whenever we see a town where a big battle is being fought and the Russians are likely to make a gain, everyone sort of, I think, fixates on that thing and loses context of the space and the time relationship. This has been a 18 to 20 month slog for the Russians to get to Pokrovsk. We assess that this effort began after the Russians seized Avdiivka back in early 2024. We explicitly assess that the Russian fall 2024 campaign was all about getting Pokrovsk, and now we are here. When we look at the tens or if not hundreds of thousands of casualties that the Russians have expended to advance the additional 25 plus kilometers to get from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, really the gains are not tremendous. It's not a rapid advance. It is quite literally a foot pace of advance, literally in terms of that's what a human does, but also those are the dismounted infantry tactics that have dominated the march to Pokrovsk. And what we're seeing here is, the culmination of this 18-month effort. It does not pretend that we are going to get a Russian breakthrough of the line after the seizure of Pokrovsk. In fact, the Russians are optimized for positional warfare and more of this dismounted, grindy sort of warfare. So I suspect that once the Russians close that pocket, it's not as if that's going to obliterate the rest of the Ukrainian lines. The Russians will in fact be lined up for more long and slow and hard fighting, and they will continue to lean into that until the Ukrainians are able to put a decisive end to that movement.
And you mentioned Minarad there. The ISW's latest map seems to show that the main road out of Minarad is now effectively cut off by Russian forces. How severe is the situation then for Ukrainian troops there?
It's a very difficult situation tactically. I mean, even if the roads were not physically interdicted by infiltrators, the Russians have the ability to effectively deny movement on the roads with mortars, artillery, and drones. And in fact, that's actually one of the key capabilities that enabled some of the later, more recent gains around Pokrovsk. Because when the Russian front line moves closer, it means the Russians are able to put drone teams closer to the front line, which means the drone teams can then extend and interdict the supply lines going into it. And so what we've observed really, what facilitated and accelerated the deterioration of the Ukrainian hold over Pokrovsk was actually not the tactical front line deteriorating directly. It was the Russians' ability to get drones to deny the highways, to deny the logistics lines, which slowly choked out the Ukrainian frontline positions. And so when we're talking about it now, this very, very late hour, I mean, it's a very difficult position to be in because of the physical infantry presence on the ground, but also the indirect fire and the drone systems. Now, again, we're going to see what happens here. I'm going to hold my breath, and we'll see exactly what happens. It depends on, can the Ukrainians withdraw in good order? What time will the order be received? How quickly can the Russians actually exploit this? And what I will say, that the following two things are always true. It is always true that whenever the Ukrainians are in a difficult tactical situation, the Russians exaggerate the extent to which the Ukrainians are totally screwed. I would note for you that back in October 2024, Putin claimed that there were several thousand Ukrainians that were surrounded in Kursk, and that the Russians were prepared to essentially annihilate, scores of surrounded Ukrainians. Putin made a similar statement just last week about Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, and there was no such massive encirclement of many thousands of Ukrainians in Kursk last October. It is also possible that we will not be seeing that sort of encirclement here. The other thing that's also true is that there usually is a back and forth between the tactical frontline Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian command, which is about the optimal time for withdrawal and pull out. And I'm not an officer. I'm not there on the front line. It's very difficult for me to be able to cast judgment on whether or not the Ukrainians withdraw on time or not. There is a Ukrainian tendency, I think, to hold on to tactical positions for too long than was necessarily required. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, it's decisive of war ending or at the operational level of war completely damning as well. So there's some interesting tactical decisions that will be made, and it's a very dynamic situation.
And we talk a lot about how Russia has been using those sort of what have been termed meat grinder tactics of advancing in smaller groups of dismounted infantry. Does fighting in an urban area benefit those tactics? Has it made it a bit easier for these Russian units and that tactic?
Yeah, that tactic is quite effective when employed in an urban environment, because urban environments are so complex. You'll have high rises, you'll have subterranean features with pipelines and sewers and things like that. You'll have places where you might have 3 to 5 infiltrators on one floor of a building or in a basement of a high rise, and the Ukrainian forces on another floor of a building. And so once the Russians can get into a urban concrete jungle, those sorts of tactics really flourish. And it's actually what makes it extremely difficult, because the Russians also resort to perfidy. They wear civilian clothing. They make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to determine and distinguish between civilians and actual combatants, which is a Russian war crime. But it makes the Russians more effective in this sort of environment. And it also makes it very hard to clear, to remove that Russian presence once it started to grow and spread. And so really what we're looking at here in Pokrovsk, and the ISW maps don't do a perfect job of covering this. No map in the open source really does. But when we code these areas within an urban environment over red and do our best to notionally create an assessment for the Russian frontline trace, really what that is it's a series of particular strong points where we've observed the Russians on the periphery, but it doesn't mean that it's not intermixed with Ukrainian positions, or that there's Ukrainian positions that Russian forces infiltrated and bypassed and got beyond, and that there's actually still significant pockets. And so what we're seeing here in this, due to these infiltration and bypassing tactics, we're really looking at like a pointillist front line where we have these Russian advances. There's actually intermixed and commingled Russian strong points and Ukrainian strong points, and they fight it out. And so it's not a gray zone, but it's an intermingling of the tactical picture. And it's very difficult to deal with. And of course, when the Russians are being able to surge in, that makes it harder too. You also asked about the weather. Weather, what we're seeing, is actually playing a significant role here in facilitating Russian tactics. On days that there is good, clear weather, no fog, no rain, no heavy wind, the Ukrainian drone picture in general is much more effective, and they're able to deny these infiltrators because you can run the drones and they can see them and strike them. Conversely, when there's rainy weather, foggy weather, very windy weather that denies the use of drones, the Russians are able to actually infiltrate in much higher numbers and make those gains. And so what we actually see is the Russians are now exploiting and increasing their operational tempo when there's crummy weather, because they know that's when they have their best chances of being able to infiltrate a whole bunch of guys to an assembly area, consolidate, and then go further. And that's, of course, interesting from a traditional military science perspective, because generally you want to conduct maneuver warfare when the weather conditions are good. So the drone picture and the drone capabilities kind of inverted the normal rules.
And has that change in the combat environment, not only weather, but also the fact they've moved into urban fighting now, has that helped Russia reduce some of those pretty significant losses that their tactics often result in?
Yes. So Ukrainian drones are not a panacea. Ukrainian drones are less effective within an urban environment for the if friend foe discrimination problem I talked about, but also there's a lot of cover in an urban environment, and when you have buildings and streets and those sorts of things, they get in the way of the physical radio link for the operator to talk to the drone. And so drones within an urban confined space are significantly less effective. And this, I think, is sort of obvious when you look at the drone footage that's on the internet and the combat footage. You'll see most of the spectacular hits happen sort of in open steppes, the rolling hills, the fields, that sort of thing, with unintruded horizons. And in urban environments, it's much more difficult to pull that off. What I would also note is what we've discovered is that there's this interesting interplay between the importance of high rises and drone operators. Drone operators really love the top floors of high rises or the roofs of high rises, because when you set up your drone antenna on the 15th floor of a 20-floor apartment building, that actually allows you to be able to beam your drone and signal quite far and be able to strike things in the rear and so of your adversary, much further than if you were to set up your antenna on the ground or just like at a tactical hill or something. And so what we've actually seen here is Russian and Ukrainian drone crews fighting very, very hard to maintain and gain positions in high buildings where their drone operators then can become that much more effective by having unimpeded ability to project their communications to their drones. And that's very interesting. And the Ukrainians like Pokrovsk because there are many of these such high rises in which they conduct these drone strikes into the Russian near rear. And the Russians also want the high rises in Pokrovsk because they want to be able to take those positions and then flip it around and use it against the Ukrainians. And so there's some interesting sort of pitched tactical battles around who controls these high rises, and they've taken on a pronounced importance. It also has some implications, I think, for defense. If you're going to retreat and withdraw from these buildings, it might be incumbent upon the defender upon withdrawal to demolish and destroy these buildings to deny the benefit that they would have to the adversary as sort of like a scorched earth tactic. But this is some of the interesting evolving character of war that we've seen.
And there's also been some footage of Ukrainian, what has been termed special forces teams being landing in and around Pokrovsk in what appear to be American Black Hawk helicopters, or American made. There's been a lot of footage released from both sides. Russia have made a lot of this, claiming that they've eliminated these teams completely. Ukraine deny that. What do we know about what is actually going on here?
Yeah, I'll be candid with you. It's a very dynamic situation, and I've read the Russian reports. I've read the Ukrainian refutations. I've not collected, and our team has not collected any evidence that allows us to say decisively what did or did not happen. It looks like the Ukrainians deployed some special forces to conduct a counterattack within Pokrovsk and relieve some beleaguered Ukrainian positions. I'm not sure what the result of that, if it was a successful mission or not. So we shall see. I don't think that was going to be the thing that was going to alleviate and take back Pokrovsk, and I don't think that was the intent. It was likely to buy some time or hold some very specific terrain or achieve a very specific objective within the context of how do we withdraw in good order. But it's interesting to sort of see a glimmer of some of the high-speed operations stuff that happens at the tactical level of war, but as outside observers, we're limited on what we actually can know about it.
And of course, the war continues elsewhere on the front. How is the focusing of Russian resources on Pokrovsk affecting other areas and other cities across Ukraine that are under bombardment? I mean, we had heard about Ukraine making some forms of advances around Dobropilya, for example, and elsewhere.
Yes. So this is really interesting. The Russians are still incapable of conducting more than one successful drive at any given time. There is, of course, fights happening all across the 600-mile front line, but really the Russians do rob Peter to pay Paul to prioritize these Pyrrhic victories for these priority sectors that they really decide to lean into. So what we saw, for example, was a Russian deprioritization of the northern front near Sumy. The Russian counteroffensive from Kursk that pushed into northern Sumy. The Russians pulled some significant brigades that were previously operating in Sumy and sent them to the Pokrovsk area in Donetsk in order to reinforce and sustain that effort. So that's significant. What we also know is that the Russians have, within Donetsk, deprioritized their tactical offensive against Konstantinivka, which is just slightly to the north of Pokrovsk, because they redeployed some of the units that were fighting for Konstantinivka to the Pokrovsk direction. And so really, when you look at these Russian drives to seize these towns, you're not just looking at the excellence of one particular battle group that's been fighting in a singular area. You are looking at the combination of Russian combat power from all across the theater, oftentimes pulled and subordinated to reinforce an effort to go push the final few miles to get over the berm and seize that objective. I think the viewers often don't appreciate all that context and exactly how difficult it is for the Russians to make these gains and the extremely high costs they pay for these gains. So the tempo is slowed in other parts of the theater. That's not to say that it's not dangerous, though. When the Russians do eventually seize Pokrovsk, this will give the Russians a decision point on what to prioritize next, where to go next, where to attack, how to attack. Based off of the current order of battle, it's our forecast that the Russians will prioritize offensive operations in Konstantinivka in order to start trying to set the conditions for a pitched battle to dismantle the Ukrainian fortress belt, which will be a multi-year campaign. But of course, the Russians have the opportunity to redeploy forces. They might decide to prioritize some things in northern Donetsk near Liman on the north side of the Siversky Donetsk River. That's an area that the Russians have been investing in as well. And perhaps instead of the southern attack against the fortress belt from Konstantinivka, perhaps they will try to go for a northern attack against Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. So that's basically what we're looking at. I mean, it's really the prioritization of one sector at the expense of the others.
And we're increasingly hearing about, and we've discussed today here, George, about how the front line is really starting to become a grey zone in several places in Ukraine. How has that happened, and how difficult is that making it to map the situation for the ISW itself?
Mapping is extremely complex and difficult because, look, and we're actually trying to think of some new methodologies and new ways of visualizing the data because the nature of the war has changed. At the tactical front line, you no longer have a clearly defined forward line of Russian troops, forward line of Ukrainian troops. As I mentioned, the Russians are doing these infiltration missions where they will bypass a Ukrainian strongpoint that is part of the Ukrainian line, take up a position somewhere in that tactical rear, and then rinse, wash, repeat until you have a couple hundred guys that are now in a new position, but they're intermingled. And so the adjective that we've been using recently to describe the front line is that it's like a pointillist front line. And if any of the viewers are familiar with pointillism or pointillist paintings, I think you have an appreciation of sort of what that looks like. It's these intermingled, interspersed dots of strong points. And the tradition in military cartography is to, take the forward line of your own troops and then run a front line that notionally connect all your front positions. And infiltration missions are sort of like an aberration. You do that in one place or on a very limited scale, but it is actually now the predominant mode of Russian maneuver. And so now the Ukrainian front line is completely peppered with all of these Russian infiltration missions. And when you draw the red line, it's a little bit too maximalist because yes, you can defend the decision to have done it that way, but you also, if you make it red, the visual language implies there are no Ukrainians here, and that's also not the case, and so they're intermixed. So in the near future, we're probably going to introduce a new map layer that will be separate from where we think the Russian advances are. That is where they've mostly eliminated Ukrainian resistance, as opposed to the Russian infiltration missions where we could have intermixed positions. I personally don't like using a gray zone because I see it as sort of a cartographic cop-out. It's very easy to just sort of be like, oh, well, we don't know, it's a gray zone. And it's one solution, but I think it's a cop-out. Ideally, you should try to embrace the complexity and try to figure it out. So that's what we're currently struggling with. I've seen Ukrainian cartographers who have access to not just open source material, and I have seen some of those maps in controlled settings where they actually do map out the strong points, and they have very high resolution maps where they will have an island of Ukrainians around this tree hedge and then an island of Russians in these field fortifications over here. And the commanders know, okay, like our positions are non-congruous or non-continuous, and therefore we have to clear these guys and break out those guys and all that stuff. And we're going to resupply our guys with drones here. And it's very complex. It is possible in principle to do that level of mapping. It's just you need to know a tremendous amount of very granular information, which is difficult to do from the open source. But suffice to say, a lot of these maps that show big expansions of red or big expansions of blue oftentimes neglect or fail to show very complex tasks. Actually, there's little pockets of things in each of them.
And speaking to Frontline last week, journalist with the Kiev Independent Francis Farrell was discussing how saturated the front has become with FPV and fibre optic drones, even in the last year of his visits to the front, and how much more dangerous that has made it for troops trying to manoeuvre there. The ISW hearing and seeing similar things, and what has that meant for any level of manoeuvre, even at the infantry level, for soldiers at the front?
Yeah, drone production is scaling and will continue to scale, and it is the primary way by which the belligerents identify and kill and strike each other. I think the latest statistic is something like drones constitute for the Ukrainians something like between 70 and 80% of all casualties inflicted on Russian forces, which is pretty incredible. By the way, just for the listeners, this is not because the Ukrainians want to use drones, they're forced to use drones. Ukrainians would love to have more conventional artillery, they would love to have armored fighting vehicles, they would love to have conventional weapons, but they use the drones because it's the implements they have and that they can use. It's not as if I think people sort of hear those statistics and they think like, oh, drones are the future of everything. And yes, drones do have a very big role in the future of everything, but the Ukrainians use drones not because they want to, they do it because they have to. For tactical maneuver, it's extremely difficult. It's super hard. The name of the game is dispersion, concealment, small signatures, because if you are seen, you are killed. And so that is why the Russians now use small infiltration teams of 3 to 5 people. It's why they wrap themselves in space blankets to hide from thermal sensors. It's why they do this in the rain and at night and during foggy conditions so that the drones physically can't fly and see them. And it makes it very, very difficult, but not impossible. Because when we do have this rainy weather, the Russians actually do revert back to the traditional tactics. And what we've actually observed over the last month is when there's rainy weather, the Russians will get into a platoon of mechanized forces and conduct a platoon-side frontal assault with armored personnel carriers and tanks. Most of those assaults still happen to fail for various different reasons, including the fact that drones are degraded but not completely eliminated. But it does impose some interesting implications, which is that if you can successfully deny your adversary's use of drones through a combination of weather and denial systems, then the old tactics of frontal assaults and the relevance of tanks in frontal assaults and the relevance of armored personnel carriers actually becomes relevant again. And we see the Russians experimenting with this. And so we must be very careful to guard ourselves from sort of big sweeping proclamations that, oh, drones have made maneuver warfare, even for infantry at the tactical level, impossible, and everything is going to be drones all the time. that's not the case, because actually that can be a reasonable assumption, but drones can be denied. If they are denied, then the old rules suddenly become relevant again.
Well, and speaking of some of the dramatic impact that Ukrainian drones have been having in recent months, there are further strikes on Russian oil infrastructure this week. What do we know about how that campaign is continuing?
It's maturing quite nicely. I mean, just yesterday on Sunday, the Ukrainians managed to conduct a strike against a very prominent Russian oil facility that I think is responsible for moving something like 20% of Russia's international oil exports in Krasnodar. So this is quite good. It's maturing. It's becoming much more effective. The intelligence sharing that the U.S. is doing with Ukraine is maturing that effort, and it's not looking good for the Russians. Now, break. I will argue and say that these economic pressure tools and these, including from the strike campaign and the sanctions, they are insufficient to bring about a Ukrainian victory. No matter how appealing alternative paths for Ukrainian victory might appear, what is required is the concentration and the focus of the applied use of violence, and that includes on the front line to physically deny Russian advances on the battlefield. We need to continue enabling these strikes. We need to continue with the sanctions and all that stuff, but Putin will not stop unless he is stopped on the field.
And obviously, Russia have been conducting their own longer-range drone activities, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere in Europe, it is suspected. Have we seen more incursions recently, and how worried should we be about the kind of build-up of Russia's own long-range drone incursions?
Yeah, we have seen an intensification, not just of drone incursions, but of manned fixed-wing aircraft as well into the airspace of NATO countries, and also in the case of Lithuania, weather balloons, or sorry, not weather balloons, but balloons equipped with a variety of things that actually forced down the closure of the international airport in Vilnius. Um, Look, this pattern of escalating activity, it began in mid-September with that unprecedented drone raid into Polish airspace, and it's only gotten worse in terms of the diversity of systems being used and the geographic extent and the scope of these things. Just the other day in Belgium, there was also a reconnaissance mission with drones above a Belgian air base that will become the future home for F-35s in 2027. So this is part of a concerted Russian effort, and it is part of, in our assessment, the phase, we call it phase zero. This is phase zero of a military operation, and phase zero is the political and psychological condition setting stage ahead of your actual other preparations for the kinetic phase of the war. The Russians are, of course, reconnoitering sites. They're learning things about the political responses that NATO member states give. And I will say it's quite disheartening to see that the alliance is not on the same page about how to respond to these acts of war. In fact, what the Russians are trying to do is sort of boil the frog here, convince the members that this is normal, accept a new normal of things that are permissible. And the Russians are deliberately trying to get us to a place where we say, well, the Russians, interfere our NATO airspace with drones and manned aircraft all the time. So the next time a Russian manned aircraft enters into NATO airspace, we actually don't need to shoot it down, and we don't need to even call for the Article 4, meeting to discuss the potential implications for invoking Article 5. And if we get to that position, then that's very, very bad, because then that will set the preferable political and psychological conditions under which the Russians then can get a tactical advantage for their actual war. And this is the whole point of this undertaking. So I think it's very important we do not discuss these events as being under the rubric of asymmetric warfare or under the threshold or hybrid, because that's a very mushy language. That's what it means, whatever you want it to mean. These are preparations for war. It is the phase zero of the future war, and we must treat it with a high degree of severity. Because if we become numb to these sorts of attacks, then the Russians will exploit it for a tactical advantage in a future war that Putin is planning but has not yet committed to executing.
And we talk about some of the disjointedness among Ukraine's allies. Donald Trump has now said he's no longer considering sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. How important is that decision, though, relative to the other support that is being provided to Ukraine at the moment? I mean, we've seen pretty significant US sanctions on Russian oil producers. There's been much wider ranging support for Ukrainian strikes and what is allowed to be hit. Does this leave a hole in Ukraine's capabilities if they don't receive Tomahawk? Or is it just that we tend to obsess over these quite, interesting and large weapons that the US sometimes offers?
There's a very interesting discussion we can have here. The bottom line up front is if we want to actually impose a loss on Russia and have the Ukrainians achieve an end state that is closer to victory than defeat, then we need to have an approach that is just no sanctuaries for Russia. I mean, the Russians enjoy all of these absurd luxuries in this war where they get to protect their rear areas, they get to protect a variety of things. We take a variety of steps to try to insulate the Russians from facing any sorts of significant problems. And we need to systematically identify all of the capabilities and special sort of golden gooses that we protect for the Russians, and then eliminate them. Tomahawks have an important role to play in this war. They can be used to destroy the Alabuga special economic zone, the factory that produces several thousands of Iranian Shahed drones per month. It can also be used to destroy the air bases where the Russians launch their glide bombers from, that are arrayed around the Ukrainian theater. And that will have important effects. It will reduce the Russians' efficacy for their strategic air and bombing campaign as we head into the winter. It can allow the Ukrainian drone interceptor program to mature. And it can also it can alleviate some of the requirements for Ukraine's air defense. You won't need quite as many Patriot launchers, which are extremely expensive and hard to procure, if you're able to essentially destroy the aircraft or destroy the production facilities for drones at the source. So, look, I hope the president will reconsider his decision. Every single weapon system of consequence we've sent the Ukrainians have gone through a similar back and forth, yes, no, debate, delay until eventual delivery process. I hope we learned a lesson, which is that these decisions, when taken sooner, are more effective than later. But hopefully we'll get there.
George Barros, Russia and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thanks so much for having me, Louis. Always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.